Welcome, Sergey. Welcome, everybody. On this tropical Dutch summer day, I'd very much like to welcome everyone to the second webinar organized by the Klingendahl Russia and Eastern Europe Center, together with Ramop Rusland, two organizations that aim to increase the knowledge in the Netherlands about Russia and Eastern Europe. And I'm particularly glad that we can do the second webinar on a topic that has long fascinated me, namely the way history and collective memory interact with international and domestic politics. And let me give you a little bit of context about that before I move in and introduce the speakers and talk you through today's program. Because speaking about the past, there are so many quotes that you could use, but one that is particularly good is by William Faulkner, who says, "The past is never dead, and in fact, it isn't even past." And I think that particularly explains also why we're trying to make sense of what is happening at the moment, or project what we would like to happen going forward by looking at what happened in the past. And history is a particularly rich repository for politicians to draw on, with full of tales of heroism and suffering and pride and pain. And they can use that both for international politics and for domestic politics and for nation building. But sometimes when they do so, they get into conflict with others. And that gets into a situation that people have sometimes referred to as memory wars, when one country's pride is another country's pain. And very few topics are as apt for that and as sort of painful for that as the Second World War, a topic that we've all in Europe and across the world have looked back on in recent months as we commemorated the tragedy of that war, but also the liberations in that war. And the commemorations that were held were very dignified, and they served as important reminders of the suffering. But we've also seen very ugly disputes, particularly in Eastern Europe, between, on the one hand, Russia and Eastern European countries such as Poland. And these have an impact also on international relations and on domestic politics. And that is why we at the Klingendahl Institute find it important to look at, because sometimes they even have international security considerations. Now, many of you will undoubtedly have seen the parade in Moscow yesterday. More than 14,000 troops marching across Red Square with military equipment rolling past, despite public health concerns, because the parade had to be moved due to COVID-19. But it still took place now, even though the number of cases in Russia are still there. And we've even seen in neighboring Belarus, where the parade did happen, that Lukashenko came under quite some criticism for going ahead with it. And the fact that it did take place draws attention to this question, why it is so important for the Kremlin, for Russia in particular, to project this image and to commemorate this victory over Nazi Germany. And that is something we would like to discuss today with two distinguished speakers who spent a large part of their career looking into Soviet history, in the case of Professor Radchenko, and as a correspondent in Russia. So let me introduce you very briefly. Dr. Sergey Radchenko, you're professor of International Relations at Cardiff University, and you're also a global fellow at the Wilson Center for History and Public Policy. You're an expert on Cold War history, on Soviet-Sino relations, but you also comment frequently on how politicians are using the past at the moment. And your Twitter feed is particularly enlightening because you draw on primary sources to debunk certain claims that have been made, and you've been very critical also about recent articles and speeches by Vladimir Putin. Laura Starink is one of the founders of Ramop Rusland. I'm very glad that we can do this together, Laura. And you're also an accomplished author who's written several books, including In the Shadow of Big Brother, In de Schaduw van de Grote Broer, and Letters from Russia, Post uit Rusland. And you've also been a correspondent in Russia for many years. And you have a long-term interest in Russian historiography and the way politicians make use of the past in Russia. And finally, my name is Bob Dane. I am the coordinator of the Klingendahl Russia and Eastern Europe Center since recently. I joined in March. And before that, spent many years working in and on Eastern Europe for the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. And that is also where I came into contact with this topic for the first time when I was political advisor on Ukraine and saw firsthand how this could lead to tensions both within societies and between countries. Now, before we delve into the discussion, a couple of housekeeping points. For those of you who watched our previous webinars, you know how it works. Where we have two groups. We have those of you in the Zoom. You can participate in the debate by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. That is already open now. You can start using it if you want. And in a little innovation, you can even vote on the questions of others if you want to push them to the top of the list. And when we come to the Q&A in about 30 minutes, I will open up the floor, and I can give the floor to specific people to ask their questions to the panelists. Those of you in YouTube, unfortunately, you can't participate in the debate, but I would very much encourage you to register with us on our website so you can be in the Zoom next time. The YouTube chat function is disabled. Now, we have only an hour for this, Sergey, because you have to go at 3:30 our time on the dot. So we have to be short and snappy. So without further ado, I'd like to move into the first part of the discussion, where I'd like to focus on the role of memory in Russian domestic politics and in Russian nation building. So Sergey, if you could be so kind just to do a little scene setter for us to explain the importance of this memory in Russian collective memory of the victory over Nazi Germany, but also the way it has been used by Putin to weave this narrative and it has become very much part of the nation building ideology of Russia. Sergey, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Bob. Well, thanks very much for having me here today. I would like to separate this question into two. I would like to talk briefly about what the Second World War means for Russians as a broader populace, and what it means specifically for Putin's regime. Those are related but different questions. With regard to the broader population, it's well known that the Second World War had tremendous effect on the Soviet Union, but on Russia, of course, as well. People, practically every family had somebody who was involved in the war, who died in the war, who fought in the war. And there is this collective memory that I think still is very, very important. Of course, as generations pass, generations come and generations go, maybe this memory will start to wear off a little bit. But today, still enough Russians have some relatives who were directly involved in the Second World War to where they can make this direct connection to the events of 1941 to 1945, because this is what is called in Russia the Great Patriotic War. On the other hand, there's also a different part of that story that I wanted to highlight, and that is what that war means for Putin and for his regime. And here what we have is a purposeful creation of a narrative that would support the current regime. Russia is not unique, and the current government is not unique in Russia in that it wants to create historical myth. Look, many countries work on the basis of historical myth. This is what countries are about creation of historical myth. For Putin, it's a particularly interesting problem because it is connected, I think, in my opinion, it's connected to this question of legitimacy of the regime. Legitimacy can be derived from various sources. For example, you can have honest elections, which of course Russia has not had for some time now, and you can say, well, here the government is legitimate on the basis of elections. Or you can say, well, we have legitimacy because we have an ideology that says that we're legitimate. This is the Soviet approach, as it were, to the question of legitimacy. They drew on Marxist-Leninist ideology, and this is what legitimized the Soviet regime in their own eyes. Even that was not sufficient in many ways for the Soviets. And then there's a third way, and that is this question of external recognition. Russia wants to be recognized, and the Russian government and Russian, Putin's regime want to be recognized for their importance. And of course, that story of the Second World War feeds right into this, because this is one moment where Putin can say, well, Russia saved the world. This is indeed what he said, exactly what he said in his speech during that parade yesterday. He said, the Soviets, the Soviet Union defeated Nazism, saved the world from all kinds of horrible ills, etc., which of course is that narrative is to a large extent true if you think about Soviet contribution to the war effort. But what is being done by the regime is cynical manipulation of this narrative in order to improve the legitimacy of the current regime.
I see. And one of the feelings that is sometimes expressed by Russians is a lack of recognition, as you said, of the enormous sacrifice that was made by the Soviet Union. And Laura, maybe if I can move to you, because we in the Netherlands have a tendency of looking, of course, westwards, feeling our liberation came from the US, the UK, Canada, and others. And maybe we're just not sufficiently aware of all the suffering that took place in Eastern Europe in what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlines for very apt reasons. Now, you've traveled extensively through Russia and you've had many conversations. I mean, did you recognize this feeling? Is there some truth to it? And even if that is the case, how did that happen? And what caused that?
Well, of course, up to a certain extent, it's understandable if you replace yourself into Russians, that they feel disrespected and they feel a lack of recognition of their suffering, which was huge. Of course, as you said, it's pretty normal that we were looking westwards because our liberators were coming from the West, the Americans, the Brits, the Canadians. But for instance, you could of course argue, why was not Putin invited last summer to the 75th commemoration of, say, the invasion of Normandy? Why wasn't he invited to the commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz in January of this year? I mean, it's undisputable that Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army, come that as it may. So up to a certain extent, I understand these feelings. But then if you look at Putin's article, 9,000 words on the victory of the Soviet Union and the way it is being treated in the West, mistreated, maltreated in his eyes. So he uses that word a lot, and it already has become an official cliche in Russian narrative, the betrayal of Munich. But if you look at Eastern Europe, then they have a completely different view of that because they talk about the betrayal of Yalta. And because they had the feeling that after the Second World War, we sort of sold them to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet army stayed for another 50 years. And I think that Western Europe, when looking to the East, then when it has a feeling of guilt, it in the first place it was a feeling of guilt towards Eastern Europe because that was part of Europe and they were left alone after the Second World War and got, in their view, a second occupation. So these two narratives are already very different. And then, of course, during the Cold War, there was a huge lack of information on both sides of the Iron Curtain, and also a huge lack of interest. And then there is the problem that in the West, of course, people look different to Stalin. There are a lot of people who put Stalin and Hitler on a par. They say there were two mass murderers who killed enormous amounts of people, and there is no other side to this story. For the Russians, there is. Has it ever been different? Yes, it has, because under Yeltsin, there was a period when communism collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed, that there was a serious de-Stalinization underway. That was actually the second time because Khrushchev started it after the death of Stalin. In that time, the Supreme Soviet even adopted a resolution condemning the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and for the first time, the secret protocols were being published in Russia. But what we see now, the last, say, 10 years, there is a kind of whitewashing going on and a rewriting of history under the regime of Putin. And collective memory is being manipulated about the war. And this means that lately it seems as if we are losing ground, which is really a pity, because what in Eastern Europe they call, with this beautiful phrase, competitive martyrology, that is like, who suffered most by whom? That's a pretty depressing blame game. In this blame game, there is one big problem for Moscow, that is that the former Soviet republics, they can always point the finger to Moscow and say it's your fault, because all the decisions were taken in Moscow, the Politburo was sacrosanct, etc. And there is not so much Moscow can say in self-defense. So what do? They point to the Second World War. They accuse people of collaborating with the Nazis, and that is a theme that is very abundant at the moment on Russian television, on that especially after the Ukraine crisis, Bandera and the SS regiments in Latvia, etc.
Yeah.
Very, very many examples. Well, is there a way out? I don't know. It's a pretty depressing sight, I think, but it's a big step back.
Now, you mentioned Putin's article, and then Sergei, I'm sure you've read it with interest and with a strong opinion as well. That came from being a professional historian, watching a head of state write an article with his view of history of the Second World War. And that's quite an extraordinary thing for a president to actually take the floor like that and insert himself personally in a debate on such a sensitive topic and such a complex topic as the history of World War II. So maybe if I can ask you again a two-part question. First, your thoughts on it. I mean, the arguments presented, the way it is constructed effectively, but also maybe if you could reflect a little bit on why he's doing this. Is this purely political or is there more to it? Because when I read it, I was also struck by the very personal tone that he put into it. And it's a president who concerns himself with history an awful lot, given everything else that is going on in his country. The heavy emphasis on history seems to increase even in his personal activity. So if you could also maybe help us figure out a little bit why this is taking place and also why now. Thanks.
I have to say, I think Putin is the first Russian leader, Russian/Soviet leader since Brezhnev, who made a personal intervention like that on the subject of history of the Second World War. If you remember, or if you know, Brezhnev had memoirs published. They were ghost written for him, of course. They were called Malaya Zemlya, about his feats that he accomplished. At least Brezhnev was directly involved in the Second World War. His role was, of course, vastly exaggerated as a part of the personality cult of Brezhnev that the Soviet Union witnessed in the late 1970s, but at least he was involved, whereas Putin was born after the Second World War. So it is very interesting to see how he tries here to play the historian. My assessment of this is, of course, Putin is not a historian. I mean, history is a difficult is a difficult science, as it were. Yeah, and I will use the word science here because it does involve certain methodology. And what kind of methodology? Well, archival methodology, for example, and Putin, of course, emphasized that he had access to archives. Presume, of course, he had very good access to archives. Selective access to archives. But it also entails weighing arguments carefully and not engaging in the errors of omission. And this is the main problem with Putin's historical take on the Second World War. He omits a lot of the context. Yeah, some of the things that he says ring true. For example, he criticizes Western powers for Munich. How revisionist is that? It's not revisionism. We know Munich was a terrible betrayal, and this is not news to historians. As a matter of fact, since Munich, there have been accounts that highlight how Munich was basically, betrayal of Czechoslovakia. So there's nothing surprising about this account. But at the same time, he doesn't really want to engage with the truth of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and that it was in a different league from the Munich Pact. Yeah, it was in a different league because it entailed division of spheres of influence and division of a country. So the way he played it in his article, that it was, well, the Soviets marched into Poland because it was just a forced move. The Germans were already doing that. That is not in accordance with the existing evidence which we have, including the protocols to the secret protocols to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We've known about that for years and years, and the fact that Putin ignores that, of course, makes his historical take rather weak, I should say. Or, for example, how he plays with terms when he talks about Soviet annexation of the Baltics as being in accordance with the prevalent attitudes or prevalent laws or something existing at that time. Well, it depends on who you compare that to, I suppose. If you compare a Soviet takeover of the Baltics to, let's say, the German takeover of Sudetenland or something like that maybe you can make this comparison. But, come on, it's a ridiculous comparison, right? And I think Putin really undermines himself by trying to defend the indefensible. He really should not do that, because he does have a point sometimes when he talks about historical evidence, and he talks about attribution of blame. Like, you can kind of see where he's coming from. So, for example, he's obviously very frustrated with that European Parliament resolution of September 2019, which attributed blame for the Second World War and highlighted Soviet and Nazi responsibility for the Second World War. As a historian looking at this, I would say there are two ways of looking at the problem. You could either say that we should diffuse responsibility more widely, because if you just say it's the Soviets and the Nazis, the question then becomes, well, what about those, what about Daladier, or what about Chamberlain, what about Munich, et cetera, what about some of the smaller players? Everybody contributed, as it were. Or you can take the other side of the coin and you can say, well, in reality, it was the policies of Nazi Germany that really led to the outbreak of the Second World War, and you cannot get around this. So I think the way that the European Parliament resolution phrased that, I think rightly annoyed Putin. However, at the same time, he has also been engaging in his own round of historical falsifications, like, for example, trying to find excuses for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It just doesn't work. So my assessment of Putin, the historian, is not very high. If that article came to me and that was the peer reviewer, then I would say, sorry, this is a fail, or revise and resubmit, or maybe outright cold fail, where he does have some archival documents. And maybe we can talk about Russian, the situation with the historical archives in Russia later on, because there's some interesting things that can be said about that. But as to the second part of your question, why does Putin do that? You have to wonder, what goes through his mind. I have been studying Russian policymakers and Soviet policymakers, starting from Stalin and onwards. Now it's possible to do because we have the archival documents that document their conversations that they have had with various people. So you really can get begin to understand how those people were thinking and how passionately they felt about certain things. So, for example, I touched on Brezhnev earlier as the first person who weighed in on the Second World War. So with Brezhnev, he really was passionate about the Second World War, and that really defined Soviet policy, and that really defined Brezhnev as a man. He had personal experience and he talked about it extensively, etc. So you can kind of make this connection, you can kind of see where he's coming from. And maybe you can say something like that about Putin. Okay, Putin is of a generation that did not directly involve himself in the Second World War, but he's of a generation that followed the generation. So his father, as he actually talks about in that article, his father and some other relatives were involved in the Second World War. So he can make this personal connection, maybe because he's been around for a long time. He's getting to that age where he's reflecting on the longue durée of Russian history, and he's trying to understand the role of his own role and the role of his generation. So those are this part of the backdrop. But if we wanted to actually drive down to the bottom, to the bottom line here, why does Putin do that? Because this generates a narrative of legitimacy for him, because it supports his. It not only supports his own legitimacy, but also it supports particular place for Russia in the international order, because in many ways, 1945 was the moment that created Russia the way we know it today, right? A global player, or the Soviet Union was a global player in 1945 and became part of the United Nations Security Council and was involved in decision-making across the world. Well, Russia's standing has diminished since the end of the Cold War in many ways. And Putin wants to resurrect this standing. And I think the narrative of the Second World War and victory in the Second World War helped him do that.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come to that in a moment, because in his article, he also actually looks forward and he makes certain claims on what Russia would like to do, where he draws parallels between the setting up of the UN Security Council and Russia's role in world governance, so to speak. But first, maybe on this argument of legitimacy and also the point of the relevance for domestic politics. Laura, it is of course no coincidence that the parade takes place on the 24th and the ballot boxes for the all-Russian vote on the constitutional changes, they start the day after. There's clearly a fusion of two things taking place. And in your article, you call this an odd mix of history and domestic politics. I mean, could you say a little bit on how you feel how this features in domestic politics, how it's being used, and also on just knowing the conversation that you have with people, how effective is that really to link something that happened 75 years ago with something that is going on now. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, it is a sheer coincidence that the victory parade and the plebiscite that starts today, actually, they have a week, people have a week to vote because of Corona, that they are taking place together, because actually the plebiscite was meant to be held at 22nd of April, and the victory parade on the 9th of May, as it is every year. So originally those two are not connected, but Corona, so this was the kind of master plan of Putin that was being changed by Corona, the pandemic that really caught him off guard. And that was very obvious, because in the beginning of the crisis of the pandemic, then he was completely out of touch, because the whole system that the strategy collapsed in a way. But then obviously he decided that it wouldn't be so bad to combine the two. So now what we see now is a kind of 2 weeks party for Putin going on, starting with the military parade, followed by this week of voting, ending in obviously most probably the acceptance of all the constitutional amendments by the population, and that fits quite neatly in his idea of how to legitimize his rule, because I think the constitutional amendments, when in the Western press, usually people play it down to the question: will Putin survive to 2036? But there is much more to it, because if you read the amendments carefully, then you will see that it's a kind of new ideology that is being inscribed into the constitution. That's 1,000 years of Russian history, Christian values, a very big role for Russian identity. For the first time, Russians are in the constitution are defined as the defining nation of the state, of the Russian state, much to the annoyance of all the other nationalities living there forever. So there is a kind of Russian light culture has been created in the constitution now. And the victory over Nazi Germany is very helpful, because, as a matter of fact, it's almost the only positive, heroic accomplishment of the 20th century in the Soviet Union. So it fits nicely into this nation-building process that Putin sees as one of his legacies, I would say. Plus, of course, where Sergei already talked about that. You know, the victory combined with Yalta, the Security Council, the role of Russia in international politics has to be stressed all the time, and it shows that geopolitics for Russia always is, or for Putin, always is more important than the people inside the country, because they are being neglected more and more.
If I can just follow up, because I also saw one of the questions in the chat come in about exactly this. This question: do these memory politics, and I'm going to read up the question of Dick Sandé here. Do these memory politics really influence the thinking and support of the Russian population for his regime, which is increasingly criticized then when there's a country in an economic recession? Does it really work, this type of linkages to generate this legitimacy?
That's very difficult to say. I mean, if you follow opinion polls, then still the majority of the population will support the amendments. But but there was also the Levada Center, an independent pollster, put the question as follows: if there would have been an alternative to these constitutional amendments, would you have voted for that? And on that poll, the majority said yes, but there is no alternative, so we vote for this.
Yeah. I see. So it is being put to them as take it or leave it. It is infused with a lot of symbolism, I mean, there's also a lot of other symbolism going on. I'm personally fascinated how religion and history and nationhood are being fused. The construction of a cathedral that is full of symbolism linking it to the Second World War. It's quite something. But looking forward at the time, because I would like to move on to this international part. Sergei, on this use of history in international relations, it's been going on for a long time. It's not new. The disputes between Russia and the Baltic states, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, but also even Russia and the West has been going on for a while. But there's such vast differences in interpretation across Eastern Europe. How could you explain this increased trend of weaponization almost of history? And as a historian, I mean, how do you look at this, first of all, and how do you expect this also going forward? What impacts this may have?
Well, as a historian, I like to leave history to historians, and I wish that it's great that you've actually called me here to express my view, because sometimes historians sometimes feel neglected in all of this, but also it's very interesting in the sense that we're sometimes expected to provide arguments for one side or the other. I mean, as a historian, I don't do that. I go to the archives, I look at the evidence, I try to evaluate the evidence for myself. I don't necessarily have any narrative that I want to support. Although, of course, I realize that as a historian, as all of us, we all have our biases. So the fact that, for example, that that my own background is, the Soviet Union or Russia, it suggests that I would also have some kind of biases related to that. But yeah, what we see in the Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and in Russia is actually very similar sort of phenomenon. And I just wanted to draw your attention for comparison. Look at some of the speeches that Viktor Orban makes in Hungary in defense of his policies. Or he just cites from historical examples all the time. There's a Treaty of Trianon. There's Hungary's partition. There's this whole narrative of Hungary rising from the ashes and coming to glory under Viktor Orban's autocratic rule. The same sort of thing is happening in Russia, and you can see this kind of parallels across the divide. They may disagree about various historical aspects or may look at history in very different ways, but it's very interesting to see how policymakers on both sides of this notional divide, East and West as it were, actually do use history to legitimize themselves, first and foremost, to legitimize themselves and their hold on power. So, yeah.
Now, I have a question coming in. I think now is a good moment to already jump to it. I'm going to weave the discussion and the Q&A a little bit more than I did last time, because I think this one follows up nicely on it. And I'd like to, Inge, if you could give the floor to Lamberto Zanier, who's asking what the impact of this is. But he can ask the question himself.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for your interesting presentations. My question, as I deal with minorities, of course, I come across in the periphery of Russia, Russian ethnic minorities living in those countries. Those minorities are, closely watched because they are viewed as being close to potentially the policies of the Kremlin. So this narrative, how do you think it affects those minorities? Is there a real buy-in, or do you see them having their own space and taking their distance from that? And in Ukraine, of course, with the conflict, especially the Donbass issue, is there a risk that this narrative may split even more Ukrainian society, with the Russian speakers being affected by it? Thank you.
Okay, have you been following the impact that this has, like also on domestic debates within societies, how this can divide a society itself?
Well, I can say that I certainly see how that has impacted on debates in the Baltic states. There is a large Russian population, especially in Latvia, for example, to a lesser extent in Estonia. I mean, I think it's less of a problem now, at least my reading of the situation. I'm not an expert on this question by any means, but I would think that it is just not the case that everybody in the Baltic states buy, or ethnic Russians in the Baltic states buy into the narrative that comes from the Kremlin or comes from Putin. I think maybe there's certainly one part of the population, or the ethnic Russian population, that does buy into this narrative, undoubtedly. But then there are many others who are actually not really interested in this kind of narratives that are state-sponsored, that are coming from Moscow. And the same, I think, is also the case in Ukraine as well. I don't think that we can easily say that, oh yeah, the Russians in Ukraine are buying into Putin's narrative. I don't think that's the case, actually. There's certainly some purchase that's happening. That's always been the case, but it is not, by any means, is not universal.
I mean, one of the trends that I've been worrying about is that as countries disagree with each other on an official level, and as presidents really have a go at each other, President Duda and President Putin really exchanging these sharp words, and countries strengthening almost their memory infrastructure. They're passing laws to enforce a certain narrative. They're changing the history curriculum. They're aiming at changing things in public space, statues and monuments. Is that it shrinks the space for dissenting views within societies. And I mean, Laura, you're someone who's been working on this for many years inside Russia. Compared to the 90s, how much space is there even to still have an alternative view on these complicated matters of maybe the Soviet past more broadly than just the Second World War? Am I right to say the space is shrinking both in Ukraine and maybe in the other countries of Eastern Europe as a consequence of this heavy politicization?
I think in Russia itself, it's very nice to notice that there are still many historians like Radchenko, who lives abroad, but is a brilliant example of people who are delving into all kinds of sensitive topics and can publish. So I think there is still ample space for alternative, for real research and publications. With regards to the minorities, for instance, in Russia itself, in September I was in Kazan, and I was struck by the anti-Russian sentiment that I noticed there. That has a clear reason. Tatarstan was an autonomous republic, and a year ago Putin took away that was a status that was given to them by Yeltsin, and a year ago Putin took that status away and wants to bring them back into the fold. And people are very outspoken and openly against the Kremlin and the Russocentric attitude of Moscow. And this you can see now also in for the first time, it's now been inscribed into the constitution, and a lot of nationalities inside of Russia are very upset about that, because it means that there is a kind of what I said, light culture. The Russians are more important than the other nationalities, and in the Soviet Union that existed as well, of course, but at least officially in the documents that was not the case.
Yeah, now of course Tatarstan, particularly difficult example, because a part of the Russian imperial pride, so to speak, is to take indeed the siege of Kazan. But then for the people who live in Kazan, who have a different memory of being taken over at that point. I've been there not too long ago, and we had the possibility to see these two different historical narratives existing side by side. But I see, Sergei, you wanted to add on this question.
I just wanted to weigh in on this, because that's something that I find extremely interesting, actually, in the discussions about Russia. Obviously, after Putin came to power already 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion even then that Putin was constraining space for expression of views, that there would be clampdown on the civil society. And of course, there was a clampdown on the civil society in many ways. All kinds of laws were passed that restricted expression of views, and media as well. The very independent media were under constant pressure and remain under constant pressure. And even in recent weeks, there have been examples of that, with newspapers coming, changing ownership and coming under Kremlin's control, so to speak. Nevertheless, one thing that strikes me that is quite remarkable is just how much space there remains in Russia today for expressing contrarian points of view about Russian history, among other things, about Soviet history. There's still plenty of opportunity for people to to make their views known. The activities of Memorial, for example, is one thing that comes to mind in this context. There's a very vibrant, robust, non-systemic opposition. That is to say, the ones that are not necessarily represented in Parliament, but that still voice their views very vocally. And demonstrate, as it were, in the street. So this kind of thing still happen in Russia, and in this sense, this for me represents Russia's hope, because as long as you are able to have this kind of debate, and of course, yes, I realize that this debate has been constrained, and people are coming under pressure. Unfortunately, I don't actually, I work at Cardiff University, so although I'm Russian, yeah, and I spent part of the year in Russia, I'm not under the same kind of pressure. Yeah, I'm not under the same kind of pressure for speaking my mind. I know that my colleagues working at Russian institutions are under greater pressure, and they're of course very brave in expressing their views that depart from the viewpoints that are being propagated by the Kremlin. But I still wanted to highlight the fact that even now, even today, even with Putin in power after 20 years, there's still room for debate.
Yeah, I have an interesting question from the audience. I'd like to pick up on the role of parliament here, because even in the Russian Duma, there's been attempts to put forward certain laws that proscribe and prescribe, right? That force certain narratives and ban others. And I would like to give the floor to Hugo Kleining, if you could be so kind. There's a question on this that I've also been wondering about that Duma resolution.
Thank you, Rob. If you can hear me.
Loud and clear now, Hugo. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I will tone down. I was struck by the fact that Putin, in his national interest article, did mention the Supreme Soviet's resolution from '89 in a sort of approving way. He cited this judgment on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So I wondered, what does that say about recent initiatives and announcements by some Duma members, to revisit this whole thing and maybe to overrule this resolution at the time. After the president has spoken, which Duma delegate would dare to pursue this policy? Thank you.
Thank you. So again, how did you see that? You've been muted. Sorry, you have to unmute.
Yes. So my take on this is that we should take the Duma with a pinch of salt. I mean, we generally recognize that the current Russian Duma, because of the nature of Russian elections, is not truly, so to speak, independent from the executive branch of the government. And while we generally recognize that sometimes, the Duma comes out, or some parliamentarian comes up with some strange idea or outrageous idea, and we tend to take this seriously. I mean, some of these things do need to be taken seriously, of course, over the long term, because the more crazy ideas you have that some parliamentarians are putting forward, the more this becomes a part of the general discourse, and it normalizes this kind of ideas. Yeah, but they're over the last even really since the Russian Constitution was adopted in 1993. If you look at the history of Russian Parliament and what kind of crazy ideas and what kind of crazy speakers have been speaking in the Russian Parliament and calling to do what, you would be horrified, I think. And I don't think we necessarily need to take all of that seriously.
Okay, so you would think that
of course Tereshkova comes in handy.
Okay, so you think
Tereshkova is frankly, her role here is absolutely disgraceful, and I personally don't understand people like Tereshkova. She could just relax with her well-earned, wonderful scientific, explorer reputation, and yet she just decided to do something like that with essentially enabling Putin to hold on to power. I think that's absolutely disgraceful. But yeah, I mean, you have cases like that. You have people like even Zhirinovsky, who regularly comes up with crazy ideas. I was just recently reading about early Zhirinovsky, actually read some of his books in the context of a project that I was doing. It's complete rubbish, of course, but it just reminded me of the fact that these people have been around for a long time. This is already from the early 1990s. The nationalists, the imperialists, etc. Lots of them are sitting in that Duma there. Yeah.
All right, Sergey, I'm fortunate that I have so many questions in the chat that I can actually use them to make the transition to the international part. Because there's one thing that Laura already alluded to, that in the article, there's quite a lot about Russia's role in world politics. It's not only about projecting an image back home of obtaining legitimacy, but there's also a clear foreign policy agenda. So I'd like to give the floor now to Kaupo Kant, who's asked a question on exactly this. If it works.
Yes, my question is regarding the kind of not domestic but international aims. And if you look at the World War II, then of course the logical end of the World War II was the Yalta Conference and what it came. And the question regarding this article is as well, that is it possible that the main aim of this article, one of the aims of this article, is also to promote the idea of new Yalta Conference, a new division of Europe or world among key Western countries, leaders, politicians, and maybe domestic also public? Thank you.
Sergey?
I think if Putin managed to get, you know, the British, the British and the Americans to come to Yalta, he would be very, very, very pleased. I think. I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I understand the question. Yeah, of course. I noticed that in the article when I got to the end. I say, oh, okay, that's where Putin is going. Effectively, indeed, if you look back to 1945, this was the moment when Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill came together in February 1945 in Yalta. This was their last real wartime conference, because Potsdam later in July was already something else. There was a lot of tension there. In Yalta, there was camaraderie, and there was this decision from Stalin's perspective to kind of rule the world in concert. Really, you know, at this point, Stalin was willing to push the British out and just rule the world together with the United States. And this kind of idea was you know, the idea there was that we don't interfere in your affairs, so we don't go to America and your sphere of influence, and you don't interfere in our sphere of influence, which includes here, you know, for Stalin, that included much of Eastern Europe. And he valued that. Stalin greatly valued that because of the legitimacy that it gave to him. I just wanted to point your attention to a book by Norman Naimark that was recently published, a fantastic book that looks at Stalin's post-war policies in Europe. And what Norman rightly points out is that Stalin he did not have a blueprint. He did not have this idea about, you know, the Soviets dominating everybody in Eastern Europe. He had different approaches to different countries. Poland, one approach; Austria, a different approach; Finland, a third approach, etc. But one thing that it was very important to Stalin was this notion that the gains that he had in Europe would be recognized and ratified by the United States. And this is the importance of the Yalta framework. Yeah, it's the ratification of that by the United States, the recognition that gave the Soviets their legitimacy. Because you can just use your power. I mean, the Soviets, they had millions of soldiers. They could just control that territory in Eastern Europe, just keep them. They also withdrew from other parts. For example, they did not end up turning Finland into you know, into another Moldova, as it were, although they could have. Yeah, they could have, but they didn't. Why is that? Because Stalin was willing to limit his ambitions in exchange for American recognition for the interests that he really cared about. And this, I think, is exactly what Putin is trying to accomplish. He's saying we have certain interests.
Yesterday are mostly people from the Eurasian Union that effectively attended the ceremony. Laura, I mean, how did you see this when you also read Putin's article and also some of Putin's other speeches? There's a question in the chat that it's not only the article but also things that he said about the Soviet borders. How do you see that in light of this attempt? Yeah.
I would like to point to I think quite intelligent analysis of Frolov, top diplomat at one of the best, I think, Russian websites, republic.ru. And he says that he has a quite interesting explanation for this strange move back to the future. You know, why the hell, why Yalta so long ago and everything has changed? And he says that Putin has always fought the monopolar system that existed since the end of the Cold War. So the USA was in charge and Russia was a regional power. Obama insulted Putin with that remark. And so he was fighting back. But then so now the USA is in bad weather as well. And what do you see? You see that there is a new, if you could call it that way, bipolar world system, but it is the USA versus China. And Russia doesn't play a role in it. So it's again a regional power. So he sees this as a way of putting himself back on the map of the world, and talking about these 5 nuclear powers that have to fight back and that have to come together and start a new world order. Yeah. Because he is afraid of being marginalized again.
Well, that's the irony of the UN Security Council seems, especially after COVID-19, even less effective at coming to an agreement on the major questions of world security, if you will. And usually now due to US-Chinese bickering, not as much anymore a Russian veto as it, or a Soviet veto as it was during the Cold War. I have only very few minutes remaining, and there's one question, and Sergei knows it's coming, and it's kind of a difficult one because I feel we've been speaking a lot about how this memory politics is affecting Eastern Europe, how Russia is an actor in this. But in recent months, we've also seen how lively debates about history and memory can be in Western Europe and in North America, and what strong grievances have come out, in particular when it comes to things like statues and monuments. So there's 2 questions coming this way. One is about Prague, about Konev, which I know, Sergei, you've been debating a little bit on your Twitter feed. So I'll first give the floor to Marie-Louise Ryback-Jansen, who asked the question on this, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question on reflecting on the context for us. Marie-Louise, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Bob. Yes, I'm very interested to hear your take on this. So we understand that just a few weeks before the planned May 9th commemoration, the municipality in Prague decided to remove the statue of General Konev. And Russia was quite angry with that. And now we understand that they're pressing criminal charges. I'm very curious to know how they're going about this. Has this been reported in the media at all in Russia? And in what court and in what legal framework are they able to do that? Do you have any idea? Thank you for your answer.
Sergei looks puzzled.
I will say off that, just regarding the illegal action, no, I have not followed that. More broadly about the debate about the Konev state statute. Yes, there has been a debate in Russia as well, but what can you say about it? Yeah, I mean, this question is connected broadly. Again, it goes back to that European Parliament resolution, which called for removal of Soviet war memorials in Eastern Europe. There is a point there, which really annoyed a lot of commentators in Russia. My personal view on this, if I'm allowed, if I may be spell it out, which it does not coincide with the more mainstream Russian narrative, is I see no problem with Konev's statue being removed. Why do I not see any problem with it being removed? Because first of all, it's in Prague, and the Czechs can sort out this problem for themselves. They can decide whose statue to keep there and whose statue to get rid of. For example, the Mongolians have a statue of Chinggis Khan in the center of Ulaanbaatar, a gigantic statue of Chinggis Khan. Well, Chinggis Khan may not be looked upon kindly in Russia, but I would not imagine that Russia would have any word, any kind of, any say in this question of removal of the statue of Chinggis Khan or building more statues of Chinggis Khan. So personally, I see no problem with the Czechs getting rid of that statue if they want to. Where the question becomes a little bit more complicated is what to do about memorials that are not devoted to specific individuals that were high up in the Soviet hierarchy, like Konev, for example. I mean, Konev was a representative of a regime, and the Czechs have a good reason to not like that regime. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. Looking back at 1940, the events of 1948, or indeed the events of 1968, that the Czechs would have their disagreement with honoring somebody like Konev. But when it comes to this question of memorials or some kind of commemoration of soldiers' graves, or just regular soldiers, then I'm in a difficult situation here. Indeed, this is where my identity as a Russian and that part of me that agrees with that narrative about Russia losing so many people in the Second World War comes into conflict with my identity as a historian who looks at these things dispassionately. So, for example, in my case, I have some relatives, or indeed, one of my grand uncles was killed close to Warsaw in 1944. So I also feel emotional about it. Let's say there's a memorial there to some soldiers, including among them is my great uncle who was a victim of the Soviet regime, much as anybody else, frankly. So what do? Do you remove those memorials? This is where I have a personal issue here. Yeah, I cannot. I'm in internal conflict with myself. I'm not sure whether to support or to say, well, the Poles can just do whatever they want and remove those memorials if they want. And another part of me saying, well, those are just ordinary soldiers that went there and they died trying to liberate Eastern Europe from Nazism. So you see, I've got a problem there. So that would be my answer. So I'm so conflicted about that.
It's already, in other words, it's already hard enough if it's a statue to an individual who may have a complex legacy as a person, but it's even harder if it's an actual war grave and there's remains of people there. That was also one of the reasons, I suppose, why this bronze soldier in Tallinn was such a heated debate, because it also served actually as a memorial to those who had fallen. But I saw Laura wanted to add on this question.
Yeah, just one quick add. That is that what's interesting is the selective indignation about this these so-called Leninopads, the demolishing of statues. Because when I was working in Moscow, Lenins were falling all over the place. But the minute the Ukrainians started to get rid of their Lenins, then Moscow was very angry. So this means, there is of course a selective indignation all over the place, also in Poland and the other countries.
But as you can see, Laura, as you can see, of course, especially from recent weeks in the United States and in Britain, for example, or in Belgium, this is not something that is unique to Russia or Eastern Europe.
Oh, no.
And the wars over statues continue and they rage everywhere. And this basically connects to this question of identity and how you feel that the prevalent historical discourses, the mainstream discourses, do not allow you to project your identity in the kind of way that you want to project your identity. Yeah, so this is certainly true in Western Europe and the United States, much as it is true in Russia. So in this sense, there's a lot of similarity.
Yeah. I'd love to continue debating.
We have our own discussion about the Jan Pieter So Koen in Hoorn.
Exactly. Yeah, and I'd love to debate this much more with you on statues, but I'm mindful of the time. I have space for one more question, which was sent in to us in advance. So I very much promised Martijn. Martijn, you can go ahead and ask your question, because it's a nice concluding question as well. Martijn Revere, you have the floor.
Hello. I've got a question. Do you think a selective way in which historical memories are processed to fit a regime's narrative, like in Russia, but also in, for example, Poland or Hungary, will backfire in the long run? As well, communist rhetoric was once common in public narrative, but disbelieved, I think, by most people in private.
Yeah, this question of going forward, indeed, does this still resonate with people, or might it eventually turn counterproductive? Thanks for that question, Martijn. Sergey, maybe first to you, and then conclude it. Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. This is a dangerous game to play. What we are witnessing in Russia today is a full-blown Second World War cult. And it's grotesque. It's appalling. It is frankly appalling. You look at, Bob, you referred to that new cathedral that they built to the armed forces. I mean, this is just vulgar stuff. Yeah, this is vulgar. And although it may, at the moment, maybe it actually causes some sort of surge of patriotism, I think the more of that state-sponsored, heavy-handed cult promotion you have, the worse actually later for the state legitimacy, because it does you kind of reflect back on this and you do think of the Soviet Union or of the worst cults that they had there or in China, etc. In the end, people do get tired of this sort of narratives, and that tiredness, I think, over the longer term will undermine the state narrative.
And the state narrative, and maybe also very sadly, the very thing that is meant to be commemorated. Because one thing that I always found very sad is that certain symbols symbols.
That's exactly the problem. That is
Yeah.
the problem. You know,
Yeah.
anything the state and Putin specifically touches loses its appeal for many people. Frankly, for many people. So I think, yeah, you know, for example. I have relatives who died in the Second World War, and they feel very passionate about it and very emotional about it. But when I see this promotion of a cult on television in Russia, it just turns me very much against it. So, and of course, you know, I'm not the mainstream, but I wonder whether this will also be the longer term effect for many other Russians, especially the younger generation.
So, okay, I'm very mindful of your time because I realize you have to log off soon. Laura, do you want to make a last comment on how you think this will affect it eventually going forward, to the value of that memory, the more it becomes politicized? Does it eventually erode its underlying value, or do you think that we will bounce back to a new normal eventually?
I don't know. I think that, as Sergei pointed out, that there are hardly any veterans left. So the war, and that's everywhere the case, is becoming more and more a faraway story. And in that respect, it will be more and more difficult to manipulate the history or to make people enthusiastic about that, I think.
Yeah.
So I really hope that that history goes back to where it belongs, to historians, and gets out of politics, either here or there. And let's try to get together and have a common ground instead of, you know, fighting each other. As
a historian, I just want to echo this. Yeah, absolutely. We historians want to deal with history. And as for Russia, I think it should start living in the present and not in the past.
Well, Sergei, sometimes the phrase is war is too important to be left to generals, but you could also say history is maybe too important to be left only to historians.
Alas.
I think there is also maybe value in this new interest across the world, actually, not only in Russia, to this attention to history, these emotions that it evokes. Maybe it also brings us back some of the important lessons. And Laura, I think you're right. It could just as easily, if we wanted to, be used to build a uniting narrative of a common victory, basically. But I think the underlying geopolitical tensions, we didn't have enough time to discuss those. But I think those also have a very important explanatory power of why certain elements of narratives have been selected. Because if Polish and Russian bilateral relations have been better, in the past, they did have a commission on difficult matters. They did try to actually come together. It is not impossible, but it requires political will to actually find unifying rather than dividing narratives. So maybe with those concluding words, I'd like to thank our two speakers very much. This is not an easy topic to deal with. It is particularly not easy to deal with over the internet, over webcams in a very hot and tropical day. So thank you for spending your time with us. Also to the Zoom and to the YouTube participants, thank you for your interest. Please stay in touch with the Klingendahl Russia and Eastern Europe Center and with Ramov Rusland, Window on Russia. As we're going to go forward, we hope to do more of such events and to bring these things to your attention, and hope to give you a chance at hearing some of the nuances that are behind the headlines. So thank you very much. Without further ado, if you have this interest in staying in touch with us, do register on the website. And then I hope to see you in future webinars. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good day.